Yeah, so I was asked a while ago, um, before the pandemic, to write a piece for a group called Ensemble Pi
Mhm.
in New York City. And Edith Corman, the director, had performed some of my other works, and she was planning a concert to deal with reparations. Um, and I said to her that I was interested now that I, not now, but moving back to New York City area, I was aware of a festival called Pinkster Day that was celebrated by, I thought, just Africans, probably beginning of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century. And during that week, Africans were free to travel and celebrate. I wanted to look into that because I was curious about, you know, thinking about reparations. I think that normally people think, well, what are we paying them back for? Um, and I think what seemed to be missing from many discussions is the fact that not only did people work for free, but the people who kind of benefit from the work knew that they were trained well in what they were doing. And after doing some research, were sometimes promised that they would be free. And I think that that is kind of missing. You know, there are people who rightfully talk about not being properly accorded money for what they've done. So thinking about Pinkster Kings, I thought about, before I did a lot of research, just looking into what happened in New York. We don't think about slavery as being an important part of New York or the North, but it was. And so that's really what I wanted to do, kind of using primary source materials to tell the story with a narrator. So Pinkster is the anglicized version of, and I'm not sure what the, I can't remember, it might be the same word, Pinkster in Dutch for Pentecost.
Right.
So
Yes.
it was, and doing some research, Easter, obviously a big holiday, Pentecost, also big, but not as big. So I guess the idea for the Dutch was like, well, if we don't allow Africans to celebrate, then they're going to run away, which was always a fear. So if we give them this holiday on a day that's not as big, but still important, then that won't make sense. So it was celebrated whenever Pentecost fell, the week, starting the Monday after Pentecost for a week. So
Mhm.
it changed with, obviously, you know, Easter changes as a movable feast.
Right.
Well, things that I wanted to express, or a few things. One, a long time ago, well, I studied with T.J. Anderson, who was my first composition teacher, fantastic composer and huge influence on me. And I remember when I moved to Charleston, South Carolina in 2000 to start teaching at the College of Charleston, he and his wife, Lois, said, you should read this book called King Leopold's Ghost. And it's about the history of the Congo. And in it are these letters from King Alfonso I to King João III of Portugal. And it was the first time I ever read, letters or any writing by an African discussing their dismay with the slave trade. And so what I wanted to do, because I think that there's so much misinformation or just lack of information of what happened. You know, it was very complex and worse than we probably are aware of, but that there were people at the time saying, hey, you know, we have basically indentured servants. I think that's how they treated their slaves, the same way that Europe treated indentured servants, you know, through warfare or for poverty. But he said, you know, we don't treat humans this way. And I want people to understand that there was resistance at the time. It wasn't like people said, oh, let's just take the money. There were people trying to stop it. And those letters are important, I think for that reason. And that what started off as kind of normal trade became something different. And I think that in considering the issues of kind of discrimination, slavery, and even the development of American culture, I think that people are less aware of the fact of why slavery became important. It wasn't important because I think necessarily Europeans saw Africans as being inferior. It became important because they saw the use of free labor as a way to make a lot of money, and they used, issues of race to justify the actions, right? So that's something I want people to understand, that it didn't start off as, oh, these people are Black, they should be slaves. More like, oh, we can use this labor, and actually we can make more money if we do more of this, but how do we justify that, treating humans this way, unless we say that they're not really the same sort of human, and I think that's something to come across. And also, and not because I did a lot of reading, it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and found out that because of Alfonso, who converted to Catholicism, there was a lot of Catholics in the Congo who had converted. So some of the Africans who were brought to the New World were actually Catholic. And this one book suggests that there was a brotherhood of Catholic Congolese that probably made it to New York. And that's why in one section of the piece, there are specific names of people who are petitioning for their freedom. And one book that I read suggested that they probably, since they all have Portuguese names, they probably worked together to try to bargain with the Dutch to get more freedom, to get more, because they have this connection to a Catholic kind of web of Africans who were brought over. And that to me was eye-opening, because, it was before the internet, that people were able to communicate and connect over the Atlantic, as it were. And that even though people were enslaved, they were continuously bargaining for their freedom. Even if it meant, which things I had to leave out, that I think the Africans realized that they were told they were slaves because they weren't Christian in some cases. So then they had their kids baptized. And then the Dutch said, we're no longer baptizing Africans because they don't care about Jesus. They just want to be free. But I think that's, all of that to me is connected to maybe the bigger issue of the piece, is that there's a lot of really interesting and maybe hard facts to kind of to look over, but that are important for us to understand, like how we got here, and that part of that issue are people who knew that they were being mistreated and tried in many different ways to get out of that situation. And that when it comes to reparations, it's not because of slavery we deserve money, the mistreatment of slavery, which is a good reason, but it's also that there was a lot of free labor and people knew that it was free labor. And the Dutch talked about it, saying we'd rather get slaves or get Africans who were enslaving to do the work than to pay Dutch people to do the work. So part of, which I think is sad, part of the American experience early on was, well, it's better not to pay people a lot of money to do work. It's better to buy people and have them do the work so we can make more profit. I wanted to create music that sounded African in the beginning. I took a course in West African drumming. I have listened to a lot of traditional West African music just because I love the sound. But I also had in the back of my mind the piece Renard by Stravinsky, which I lived in Paris for 2 years, and I once watched a performance with Pierre Boulez, and there was a procession in, and then the piece. So originally, before COVID, the idea of Pinkster Day was that the opening section, which has a lot of repeats in it, was supposed to be a procession, so that everyone would process in like they're having some sort of official pronouncement. And then you have the pronouncement, and that's why also at the end, thinking about Haydn and the Farewell Symphony, in protest, people stop playing and walk off the stage. But the use of the clarinet seemed to be the one instrument that might sound like it could come from someplace other than Western Europe, maybe as an opening. And the use of the violin, especially in, I think, Greed, that section, thinking about fiddling kind of traditions in the United States, which come from kind of African sensibilities. Fiddle and banjo music was very important to the United States and African community. That's why in Roots, there's a character named Fiddler, because they were very important. So I wanted to address that in some way. And then thinking about the structure of the piece, start with clarinet, and by the end, the last section, the cello is the soloist. So it's kind of like this, progression up, down to kind of this weighted, for the weighted comment, you're with the lowest instrument. And the piano is always just adding texture, atmosphere. Coming up with the actual narration part.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a lot to do with the person who did the original narration, Damien, because I'm fine as a scholar kind of writing things down and copying things down, but actually writing a text that I resisted personality in the text at first. And which is interesting, because I was involved with a project that fell apart where a historian wrote a text and I made it more singable. But because this wasn't singing, I thought, oh, well, it's just, the person could just read this. And Damien said, it's interesting, but it seems like you're resisting putting yourself in it. And I thought, yeah, I guess I am. Because it's a lot of difficult stuff. And I didn't, I was kind of sticking with some sort of intellectual, scholarly distance, just kind of reporting the facts, as opposed to, if someone is supposed to represent being a leader, then they're going to have opinions. And those opinions, or responses at least, to the text are important for the drama, because there is quotation of, taken out of context sometimes from the 17th century or the 16th century. And whoever is the narrator, the audience is going to need that person to respond to that, more than one would in writing a scholarly paper where you kind of explain the last quote. They really have to respond, not as a scholar, but as a human, for the narrator to be believable as someone who is engaged in this discovery with the audience. So for me, that was the most difficult thing, figuring out how to make this narrator more of a real person than an MC. Yeah, the one moment to me is the crux of the whole matter, is in the last section where the narrator's reading from a real court proceeding in the New Netherlands settlement, or New York, where they acknowledge, like, yes, these Africans were promised to be free 17 years ago, which means that there's a whole lot of information that's missing. Like, how long and how often did they ask? And how did it get to the point that the Dutch had to relent and say, okay, we're going to do something about it now, 17 years later? And in that, and I think in the text, they say, well, we have to free them because it's kind of hard for them to raise money to support their families. Like, there was a lot of negotiation going. But there was this status that the Dutch created called half free, where we'll free you, but you have to pay a tax every year. Otherwise, you go back into slavery. And for me, that was the most surprising thing, that yes, we've responded to what you've asked for, but we're only giving you half of what you asked for. And so in the text and in the piece, the narrator kind of stops the music, as if they are discovering, like, wait. So your answer is to make them half free? And then that's kind of what starts the final procession. We return to the early music, and the early music is vibrant, maybe agitated. And to me, that's kind of the moment. So I grew up in the East Coast. I said earlier, I was a choir boy first at St. Thomas Church in New York City, way back in the 20th century. And while I was there, I started piano lessons, and I sang after graduating from choir school in ninth grade, which is, sorry, in eighth grade. I went to high school and started taking organ lessons, and continued playing piano and singing in choirs, and eventually went to Tufts University, and that's where I met TJ Anderson. You know, originally I was thinking about going to college for organ performance and realized that I like playing the organ, but I don't like performing the organ. I don't like playing in front of other people too much, was the problem with your performer. But at Tufts, I played in their chapel for different services, and TJ Anderson, fantastic composer, heard me playing, and I think I was a sophomore, and he said, "Who are you? And are you studying music?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm taking theory." So spoke to him. And obviously, because of my time at St. Thomas, I was aware of composers, but I didn't think that that was a possibility, or I didn't know how that would work. So it's not even in my purview. So that's really where it started. I started taking composition lessons with him, went to UC Berkeley for graduate school, studied with Ollie Wilson, who was another important mentor, along with Andrew Embry, Richard Felciano. Luckily, fortunately, when I was at Berkeley, I received the LAD prize. I studied in Paris for a couple of years and audited classes at IRCAM, and sang at the American Cathedral while I was there. And then finished my degree back in Berkeley, taught at Wabash College for 2 years, and then 9 years at the College of Charleston, and now I'm at Drew University in Madison, and also teach in the pre-college program at Juilliard on Saturdays. I love teaching theory. I love teaching theory. I mean, I love teaching Black music in America because for the same reason, where I feel that the joy of teaching is the epiphany moments that happen. And theory I love because it's a hard sell, because before anyone comes into my theory class, they've learned that theory is difficult, potentially unnecessary if I want to be famous as a musician, and kind of a hard pill you have to swallow and move on. So my job is to get them to see that it's not so difficult and what makes it interesting. And that's really what I just love. Like, for instance, we just started talking about the Neapolitan Six, and I tell them, like, look, we are now to what I really love talking about. You know, it's really kind of how music theory is about language and not about rules. And how do you manipulate different words to express different things? And so, yeah, I love teaching theory. And I love teaching fundamentals too, for the same reason, because with any student learning, and I tell this to them all the time, the way to think about theory is to think about your own kind of response to the world. There are different ways of figuring things out in theory, and your way is the best way. So if you start thinking about it that way, then it makes it easier. And I also think of it as a way to kind of encourage students to see life that way. Your way of solving problems is validated by the fact that it always works well, or you can get to the answer you need to through your understanding, as opposed to assuming you have to do it some other way. And so for that reason, theory it's always more than just theory for me, is why I love teaching it. Well, I want to thank all of you. Not only do I like the piece and just happy that anyone is performing it, it is really one of the pieces that I wrote during lockdown. So it is so connected to me, really spending a lot of time in one room, reading textbooks and writing this piece that I knew was for performance, but never really kind of conceived, because during lockdown, that any audience might actually hear it, if that makes any sense. So I thank them for all the work. And I know that, especially the first section for the musicians, sorry, I know I like complex rhythms, and and for the audience, you may not hear, it may not sound as complex as it is, but it is. So Thank you, musicians, and thank you, and thank you for everyone, and thank you to you. Thank you to SOLI for not only programming it, but talking to me about it.
Yeah.
I appreciate it very much.